We're all used to seeing pro-marathon runners like Eliud Kipchoge here running in full flow with beautiful, efficient running form. But what we don't often get to see is what happens to that smooth technique when these runners run at more normal paces, like in this clip where Kipchoge's running at roughly 4-hour marathon pace in the recovery between his 1,000-meter intervals. Let's take a closer look at how his running form changes when he runs at a pace that you and I might run at, compared to the 2 minutes 47 per K, which is roughly 4.5 minute mile pace we see during his intervals in the faster of these two clips. Okay, so in these two sets of clips, we've got Kipchoge here and Kipchoge here that I want you to keep a close eye on. We're going to start looking at posture and his upper body carriage and then move on to look at particularly his stride pattern. So take a look at this as he's running at a faster pace. So as we have him coming through stride by stride, we'll get to a point where we're side on, running at 2 minutes 47 per kilometre, so about 4.5 minute mile pace. This is quick, as you'd imagine. Posturally, nice and upright, nice and tall, with a nice long flowing extension pattern to help him really drive that stride length. As we're running at the slower of those two paces, you can see, okay, it looks very different, as again you can imagine, but there are some consistent factors that I really want to pick on. So what we can see again is at that point of the rear foot just leaving the ground, we're still nice and tall. The chest isn't quite as open, but nice and tall, nice and upright, not bending forward at the waist, okay, but with a gentle forwards lean. Still maintaining that factor, it's just not as dramatic because the pace isn't obviously quite as much. But look at what the arms are doing. Okay, as we just get rid of these red lines, have a look at what the leading hand is doing as we come through. So the far side hand as we look at it on both sides. Okay, so as we come through, comes to a point where it stays fairly close to his chest. Okay, he stays with his hands relatively close in this kind of short lever position with his arms, and again with the hands, so I'm talking about close to his chest here and here. With the other side, the side that we can see, he maintains a relatively short angle at the elbow. So again for your shoulder, elbow, there we go, 73 is 74-ish. Okay, we'll look at this side. Again, very consistent in terms of maintaining that short angle at the elbow. But it's actually the arc of swing that changes. Okay, so what I mean by that, if I'll just sync these two clips. As he's running, you'll be able to see that as the hand comes forward, it comes a lot higher with the side where we're running faster, meaning that the upper arm is swinging further forwards. And as we come back to the point where the elbow is as far back as it's going to go, if we look here versus looking here, again we can see the arc of swing that the arm's going through is again that little bit greater on this side. So we're working through a bigger arc of swing and a slightly shorter arc of swing. Now, what I see consistently is, and for those of you who spend a lot of time studying running form, this will be really obvious to you, but perhaps not if you've not spent a lot of time, is that the further back we drive the elbow with more power, we drive back the elbow, the better we're going to get extension out of the rear leg, the harder we're going to drive back into extension. So where we don't need as big dramatic a push into extension, then naturally we're not pushing as hard back with the elbow. You'll be able to feel a big disconnect if you go and play with this. If you suddenly start driving the arms back really hard, the legs will want to follow. And in fact, if you just don't allow the legs to follow, it'll feel really weird. The upper body and the lower body are so closely intertwined like that. Okay, now moving on, I want to stick with this point of terminal stance, the point where the foot's about to leave the ground. Okay, here. And I want to look for our parallel lines sign. So there we go, draw the line tool. From here, hip to ankle. From here, hip to ankle. What I want to see consistently for a runner who's not overstriding is that we see at least at this point of toe off, this point of terminal stance, okay, so the point where the foot's about to leave the ground here. If we freeze frame at that point, I want to see that we manage to get so that we see these two parallel lines. If we don't see them, and if we see the lower leg swing out in front, particularly so the shin comes through vertical, we're setting ourselves up to overstride. You can see Kipchoge here manages to hit that parallel line really nicely, even though he's running at what for him is a very slow pace. And in fact, here, running at a pace which is quicker than his marathon PB, he's working hard at this kind of pace. 4.5 minute mile pace, it's more than is going to be sustainable for, well, obviously for a marathon because it's quicker than his marathon PB. He is in this slightly more compressed stride. It's getting towards sprinting for him. It's not sprinting, but it's getting towards sprinting for him, meaning that we're well through our parallel, which is a good thing in terms of stride length, good thing in terms of not overstriding, just hard to maintain for long periods of time. Now, let's be real with this clip. These are all great, great runners. To be able to hang with Kipchoge doing a K-rep session, you're clearly doing a lot right. But I want to just quickly highlight something in terms of this slow pace and a comparison between two runners. So I mentioned stride angle, I mentioned these parallel lines, and I make no apology for kind of going on and on about this because it's such a fundamental. So as we get to a point where we just leave the ground and we know we're starting to see these parallel lines from Kipchoge, here we go, quickly draw them in again. You see what I'm talking about. Okay, parallel lines here. Let's have a look at this guy in the blue. Okay, this guy here. Now, as I said, a good runner. I don't know who he is, but as we get to this point where foot's leaving the ground, this is what I'm talking about. Okay, this is not the parallel line that I want to see. Okay, ideally at that point, I'd want to see this lower leg here, which is only going to happen if, in fact, what we are going to see is a little bit more hip flexion. So if we were here, I'd be much happier. Instead, what we're seeing is that we're more like here. Okay, and as I said, it sets up for that lower leg getting out in front, that heel getting ready to strike too far ahead of the rest of his body. So, not a bad runner. Okay, clearly, like I said, doing a lot right, but a real stark comparison in comparison to Kipchoge here, where we can see that as that foot comes off the ground, okay, we are still the right side of vertical. Okay, we're not allowing that lower leg to flick out in front. Okay, what I'm seeing with the guy here in the blue, that's where I describe things getting a little bit sloppy in comparison to nice controlled with Kipchoge. Okay, before we move on, let's take a quick look at the height of his kickback, the height at which he carries his foot underneath him across these two paces. Again, we're looking Kipchoge. So at this faster of the two paces, we know he needs a bigger stride length. Okay, we know that a lot of that stride length is going to come through him swinging that leg through underneath him, getting a good knee drive and a good amount of separation between lead and trail hip. To do that at this pace, he's got to pick his foot up significantly underneath him, but it's not going to be a lot of active concentric work through his hamstrings picking his foot up. A lot of the stretch through his hip flexors here, at this point where the foot's about to leave the ground, a lot of that is going to be released as we come through the next few frames, and we can see at this point where the other side, the standing leg, passed underneath the hip, we can see how short lever we are at that pace in comparison to what we see at this point, at this pace on the other side. So as we come through, strike the ground, at the point where we're foot underneath hip, much lower carriage of the foot, much longer lever. He doesn't need to pick the foot up any higher than that at this pace. He doesn't need to start running around butt kicking because he knows subconsciously, I'm sure it's not something he thinks about, but his body knows that he needs to just pick the foot up sufficiently so that he can clear the ground allow the knee to drive through, and then set up that nice little landing underneath a flexing knee. Okay, so again, just a really nice example of how it scales up and down for pace, the height at which you actually carry that foot. Now, when we're playing it through at this kind of pace, what we actually start to see quite clearly, if we play one by one, is the difference in terms of vertical displacement as well. I'd argue that he's somewhat smoother in terms of his stride, in terms of the up and down, when he's running at that faster pace, in comparison to what we see here, where at this slow pace, which for him, let's not forget, is a slow pace, there's a little bit more bounce. Okay, I'd argue he's less efficient at that slower pace. It probably feels nice and relaxed, but it certainly probably feels a little bit more bouncy and less smooth than when he's running quick. But what is noteworthy is the fact that even at this pace, he doesn't allow himself to become ploddy, heavy underfoot, start overstriding, start heel striking heavily. Okay, not there's anything wrong with a heel strike, but he manages to keep control of his form, and that really is what it's all about. So if you're out there on a Sunday at long run pace, running nice and easy, feels very different, obviously, to if you're out doing a hard, fast 5K time trial. The key is just to allow yourself just to find that relaxed form that doesn't get lazy, that doesn't get ploddy, doesn't get heavy underfoot. Do you feel yourself starting to get heavy underfoot? Think about your cadence, think about your posture, and think about just picking the foot up enough so that you can start feeling that slightly crisper landing underneath the flexing knee. While we're talking about things like foot strike, I want to show you a clip that's been submitted by one of my subscribers, Daniel, as I know that what I'm about to point out will actually help a lot of other people too. There's a link in the description if you want to submit your own running clips so I can take a look at your running form too. Anyway, Daniel's been running for about 3 years. He's got a history of injury on the right-hand side of tibialis posterior tendinopathy. Tibialis posterior is a muscle deep on the inside of the lower leg, and its tendon wrapped underneath the inside of the ankle to help control pronation as we land and load. Now, I want to show you a few things in terms of Daniel's running form that really is not helping when it comes to how tibialis posterior loads and the stress and strain it has to deal with. So he says that he's aware that he's got fairly poor ankle dorsiflexion and his heels stay off the ground throughout stance. And I want to show you exactly that, because I think in his description that he sent these clips through, I think he's not far off exactly right. He's very much a forefoot striking runner. Okay, I'll let this play. You can see if we play this through a little bit faster. There we go. You can see how he lands on the balls of his feet, and the heels barely, if at all, touch the ground. Now, if you're a sprinter, great. But if you're any kind of distance runner, this is going to be hard work on your calves very, very quickly. And calves don't just mean gastroc and soleus. We've got little muscles like tibialis posterior, particularly if you're starting quite supinated, so on the outside of your foot and rolling in, that is going to have to work overtime to control this. Now, if you bear in mind what we saw just then from that side-on perspective, and now we look from this rear-on perspective, can you see how, at this point, as Daniel comes through and strikes the ground, it's with the outside of the forefoot. Okay, we're always expecting to land supinated and roll into pronation, but the combination of quite a significant forefoot strike here, quite plantar flex, so toe down, that straight away means we're loading tibialis posterior and its tendon in a shortened position, and its role is to eccentrically control, so lengthening under load, this movement of pronation, this rolling in. So here, tib post is working really hard to control that roll inwards of the foot. Now, that would be fine if it was allowing, if his form allowed for a little bit of, think of it as a little bit of respite with each stride for tibialis posterior, just to allow the foot to come down to flat, to load through the heel. I'm not asking you to heel strike, but if we had a form where as the foot landed and loaded, we actually came down and allowed the foot to load flat, then we wouldn't be constantly putting the pressure up through the forefoot here, meaning the lever that around the ankle is applied is so much greater than it would be if we were loading up through the midfoot or rear foot. Because with such a long lever, the stress and strain that goes through tib post is going to be that much more. The time under tension, because we're not allowing that unloading by coming down to the ground, is going to be that much more too. And as we're dorsiflexing over the top of a standing foot, we're compounding the issue. And obviously you have to, because that's just striding through onto the next stride. So what I would ask Daniel to work on in this instance is to try and feel for the heel coming through to flat. But the big problem for a lot of runners like Daniel, and quite frankly for myself as well, is that if you're quite limited through ankle dorsiflexion, if you have just generally quite stiff ankles, and that may be due to previous ankle injuries, I certainly sprained my ankles a lot playing rugby, you might find that you're predisposed to run on your forefoot, but also you find it quite hard to actually achieve the range of motion at the ankle to allow yourself to come down to foot flat. So there's a couple of things that you can do. Okay, so firstly, some mobilizations with movement, which again I'll leave a link down to in the description of this video, but I know Daniel's been doing this anyway. The other thing that you can do that some people will not like the sound of, but I actually think could be an easy win for a lot of runners, is just grab some off-the-shelf heel raises. Go to your local pharmacist, grab a couple of heel raises, 4 or 5 mil heel raises, stick them in your shoe, and you're effectively bringing the ground up to you. It won't change how the ground feels under your forefoot, under your midfoot, but at heel level, you're effectively bringing the ground up to you and just giving yourself a chance to offload through a tib post. And this is the same conversation if it's someone who's struggling with Achilles tendinopathy or plantar fasciitis. If it's an ankle range issue, then give yourself a little bit of help. So that for me would be an easy win. But what I'll do is I'll put together a PDF document which you can download from a link down in the description of this video that will go through some mobilization work for those who have tight calves and stiff ankles, but also an all-round ankle strengthening routine. Some exercises which will build strength in muscles like tibialis posterior, as well as your calf muscles, tibialis anterior, all the important muscles around the lower leg and calf, so that you can feel that you have stronger lower legs when it comes to running. I hope you found that helpful. Next up, check out the video linked on screen right now, because there's one reason why so many runners waste a load of effort while they run, and it's easily fixed once you know what to look out for. I'll see you over there.